Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. Today I'm speaking with Robert Pondiscio. Robert is an author and an educator. He's got a book out called How the Other Half Learn: Equality, Excellence, and the Battle Over School Choice. And I recently read an article he did in, I believe it was the Federalist, the Fordham Institute. And it's called, I believe, Anti-Racism is Misguided. Can I Still Teach Black Children? Hi, Robert. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to, I read that article you'd written, and I've been kind of speaking out against this stuff first before I even knew kind of what it was. And then the more I started looking into it and I started seeing it getting into education, and I'm just like, okay. And when I say this stuff like the anti-racism training, call it CR, critical race theory if you want, because I know there's arguments about is it truly or not, but like the way they're teaching kids about power and power roles and who's oppressed and who's the oppressor. I mean, and that stuff really came to a head last year after the killing of George Floyd. Now, if you could talk a little bit about how you got into this space and then a bit about your book, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, well, I'll just give you some brief backstory of my educational career. I'm a second career teacher and educator. Until I was about 40, I worked in the news business. I was in radio news, and then I spent many years in the magazine business at Business Week and Time magazine. So I've often joked somewhat, archly, that teaching was my mid-career impulse purchase. In other words, there was never a moment when I was a young person. I was not that kid, who at age 7 was playing school with his friends or her friends. So it was kind of, I envisioned going into teaching as kind of a 2-year mid-career public service stint, and then it kind of unwittingly became my second career because I became, how can I say this, somewhat militant, I suppose, about issues pertaining to education. Once I was exposed to, what we were doing for kids in urban classrooms. I was a 5th grade teacher at a low-performing South Bronx public school for 5 years, and then got very interested in issues of curriculum, instruction, pedagogy, school culture, etc. So I've, ever since then, I've been an intermittent teacher on and off. I was only in the classroom full time for 5 years. I'm not teaching at present, but I was teaching as recently as last year at a charter school in New York City. So, in other words, long story short, is I've kind of made my second career into a career that's all writing and all about and analyzing the stuff that, frankly, we don't really talk about a lot in education policy, which is what happens in the classroom all day. What are students learning? What are teachers doing? What's the preparation we're giving kids, teachers, etc.? I've often observed that folks who kind of write about education for a living tend to treat the classroom as a bit of a black box, and they're a little bit incurious about what goes on inside. I'm just the opposite. I'm probably almost to a fault only curious about what happens inside. I don't write about issues like school funding and whatnot that other people seem much more interested in. But that's the backdrop for both the book that I wrote, which is about Success Academy, a charter school network in New York City, and about the work that I do week in and week out at the Fordham Institute, which tends to be about educational practice as opposed to educational policy.
Okay, like some of the stuff you mentioned, Like I know you mentioned policy and funding, but I just have a question on that because,
sure,
I mean, funding is based off of policy, though, right? Like, I mean, if
yeah. No, I don't mistake me. I'm not pretending to be blithe about things like education policy. Like I'm a charter school guy. I'm a choice guy. These issues matter to me quite a lot. I'm not saying those things don't matter. I'm saying they get a lot of oxygen in the media and in think tanks like the one that I work in, where classroom practice tends to be a bit of an underexplored vein of ore.
Yeah, I mean, okay, again, like I mentioned, this is just me, some guys doing Google searches and looking at stuff, and I'm looking at these things. And so when you look at the stats of how poorly students are doing, I think it's 66% can't do math, or like something, a similar number can't read at grade level and things like that. And I look at the curriculum that's coming out. Or, I mean, lately, I mean, you had it in Virginia, California's just come out with it. Seattle had something similar with their maths curriculum where, they want to get rid of track programs. They want to, you can only take AP courses in junior and senior year, that kind of stuff. So when you see that, like when you're not teaching the kids to read, but you're teaching them how they're oppressed, like I've spoken to a couple of teachers and they said that that's, coming from the colleges of education a bit, but
Yeah.
is that impetus like from the academy or is it more from the government?
Yeah, I mean, there is so much to unwind in that very good and essential question. There is an assumption, and this is going to get really detailed and wonky, forgive me in advance, but this gets to the heart of why I tend to focus on what happens in classrooms as opposed to policy. Look, I am not at all blithe about curriculum and instruction. It's kind of, what I live and breathe. But there's this idea that's at loose in the land, that we have control over it as commentators, as policymakers, et cetera. So what you're just describing, for example, you cited the Virginia example and a few others. I just wrote an extensive piece for an upcoming issue of Commentary magazine about California's ethnic studies curriculum. And a lot of the controversy, while earnest and serious and important, is predicated on a flawed understanding. There's this idea that, well, once you, as an activist, as an advocate, once you get some say over what's in, quote, the curriculum, and I'm making air quotes that our listeners cannot see around the curriculum, well, you think you've accomplished something. You think you are now, you have determined what gets taught, what does not get taught. Well, that's just not the way any of this works. There was a study done by the Rand Corporation some years ago that showed that, and this is from memory, so don't yell at me if I've got this exactly wrong, but some extraordinary number, like 98% of teachers, both primary and secondary, rely primarily on materials that they either create, find, or adapt in teaching. So in other words, curriculum almost never gets taught as written. So you have to go to the next layer of the onion, especially when you're talking about things like critical race theory, like anti-racism or whatnot. It really becomes a function of what is the teacher choosing to put in front of his or her students. They have an extraordinary amount of control, which people don't realize. And what are the beliefs that they bring to bear, in any of the countless classroom interactions that happen on a given day. So in other words, you really have to look at this not as an issue of, this curriculum good, this curriculum bad, but what are the attitudes, values, belief sets that teachers have? And you're absolutely right. This gets back in many instances to schools of education, which do overtly encourage in many instances and expect teachers to demonstrate a so-called disposition towards social justice. Now that sounds bland and anodyne, and nobody is in theory against that, but the question is how it manifests itself. So it becomes, I don't mean to say to sound defeatist about this, but it's really, really hard, maybe even impossible to know on any given day what material, ideas, values kids are being exposed to in a given classroom, in a given school, anywhere. Because everybody who's been to school, I think, has the common understanding that there's certain expectations or certain things you can say and cannot say, but that's simply not a function of quote the curriculum.
Okay, like I said, I'm just again, I'm probably going to make a lot of mistakes on this stuff because I'm just from the outside looking in. But now, when you said teachers have choice, and I mean I get that, like going back to I was in high school in the '80s, so it's a while ago, but. My English class might have read Lord of the Flies, and then my friend's English class could have read The Crucible, whatever. So I understand that, but now, yeah, but it depends on who's doing what. But now is it easier in a district public school to stray from? They give you 5 recommended books, but the teacher says, you know what, I don't like these. I'm going to get my kids to read Huck Finn. Now, is it easier in a public district school or is it easier in a charter school?
Here I go again. The answer is, I'm afraid it depends.
Okay.
I mean, there is kind of an interesting, and sorry, I will get around to that question, but this is just another layer of complexity. So I've painted a picture so far, because I think it's an accurate picture, of a thing called teaching, a profession that its practitioners are acculturated into the idea that they are not just expected but required to figure out what's best for each kid, to tailor the curriculum for the interest and engagement of individual students. That is considered a good practice. And it's complicated. Let's put that aside. We can talk about that more, because I'm not sure it is a best practice, not because I want to control, what kids learn, but because I think it just makes the act of teaching more difficult. Okay, but so you're already starting with a basic expectation, again, as best practice, that teachers are going to customize everything every day. So you've got that. So the idea that any district has a curriculum, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I mean, the school where I taught in the South Bronx, we simply did not have a curriculum. It was 24 kids reading 24 books, so to speak, and then I was supposed to, teach each one. It was kind of crazy. But there is, interestingly enough, if you look at this from the standpoint of the law, it's a very different matter. There have been any number of Supreme Court and federal court decisions in the U.S. that have basically held that, look, teachers do not have free speech, that they are, quote, hired speech, and that they are expected to teach the curriculum. And that decision is made by school boards, 13,000 of them across the country. So there's this kind of enormous gray area and almost a conspiracy of silence, where best practice says everything has got to be bespoke, but the law says, sorry, teacher, you don't have that power. And this almost never gets contested, except, in cases every now and then. There was one in Indiana, for example, where a teacher was fired for, again, from memory, don't yell at me if I'm remembering this incorrectly, where a teacher was fired for expressing a negative opinion about the war in Afghanistan, or maybe the Gulf War, in a military community. So that was viewed as not protected speech, for example. And then again, you've got any number of teachers who, with this social justice orientation, think that they are doing a service to kids, particularly kids of color, by doing what they call disrupt texts. In other words, they're not going to teach The Lord of the Flies or The Crucible. They're going to teach The House on Mango Street. They're going to teach Maya Angelou. And there's nothing wrong with teaching those things. But the picture I'm trying to paint for you is one where there's just really not a lot of predictability anymore in terms of what kids learn, what kids read, the literature, the ideas that they're exposed to in any given place, in any given school, even across the hall in the same school anywhere in this country. It's a little bit chaotic, and the important point is it's chaotic not by accident. At this point, it's chaotic somewhat by design. I'm not saying that's right, but let me be clear on that. I'm not saying that's a good thing. There's a lot of problems with that. But this is the larger point I'm trying to make here is a lot of us who argue about what kids should and should not be doing are grossly overestimating how much control we have from the outside in dictating that.
I wanted to get to something that's kind of around this, because you mentioned it in your book, is like the title of your book, School Choice. Now,
yeah,
when I was growing up, my parents moved to Canada when I was 6. Between kindergarten and grade 6, I went to 8 different schools. A couple of times because we moved, but mainly is because my mom was like, I heard this school's a lot better, so I'm going to put you there. They're all public schools, and none of them were private. But she had that choice. Now,
yeah,
what I'm seeing that debate coming up now in the States, and some states are legislating that the money follow the student, and I mean things like that are starting, and then I, read Thomas Sowell's book about charter schools, and you read about charter schools in the same building as a public district school.
Sure.
Where the charter school is doing much better with the same population base. Like, why do they think school choice is a bad thing? I mean, my mom had that choice. She sent me to a bunch of different schools, and like I said, a couple of times it was because we moved, but she did what she thought was best for her kids. Now,
yeah,
if you're a family with 2 or 3 kids and one of them is doing really good in a public district school, leave them in there. But one of them, let's say, would do better in a charter school. I mean, why is there such opposition for the parents having the choice of where to send their kids?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's interesting. It was news to me until fairly recently, um, the degree to which the United States is somewhat of the outlier here. In other words, other countries, and I learned this from a woman named Ashley Berner at Johns Hopkins, who wrote a fantastic book a few years ago. I think the title was No One Way to School. Other countries are far more pluralistic in their approach to public education. In other words, it's a lot more common in the Netherlands, in the UK, in Canada, for schools to be publicly funded, or government funded, but not government run. The way we do it in the US is the vast majority of students attend schools that are both government funded and government run. That's the default setting. And by habit, any exception to that seems to need to justify itself, against that model. And look, I'm an unabashed choice guy. And one of the reasons I've become an unabashed choice guy is for all of these reasons we're discussing. It just seems burdensome to expect any single school to be all things to all kids or all families. So let's not start. Well, let's not try. Let's have a little bit more choice. I think that's an potentially elegant solution to a lot of our dilemmas. But what choice looks like in the United States, you've had a charter school movement that is about 25, 30 years old. And what those are, they're still, quote, public schools insofar as they are publicly financed, but they are privately run. But they tend to be, in fact, I'm quite sure they are, non-sectarian, not religious schools. What you don't have as much, although we're starting to see more, is real choice, vouchers, so to speak, where the public dollars will follow the kid and give the parent some latitude about the school culture, the school type, the school flavor, so to speak. So this is, again, much more common in other countries where the theory is as long as you're following the national curriculum, and that's a interesting thing because we don't have one of those in the U.S. But in many other countries, as long as you're following the national curriculum, they're not concerned about whether it's a, quote, public school, private school, religious school, etc., as long as you're following the national curriculum. It's an interesting model, but frankly, one will never get here in the U.S. entirely because the Constitution forbids anything like a national curriculum. Schools in the U.S. are under state control. The U.S. Department of Education is not a national school board, so to speak. It has no control over what gets taught in the various states. So, school choice, and I'm, again, an unabashed school choice guy, it's very much on the march right now in the U.S. You're seeing things like education scholarship accounts and other mechanisms to help parents get out of bad situations in public schools and use public dollars to pay for private school placements. But it's still far, far less common than it is in many, maybe even most other countries.
With respect to what you'd said about curriculums and how much freedom the teachers do have, but I'm going to give 2 examples. Like, one was in Texas, and I believe 16 other southern states. Again, this is going from memory, but I know Texas for sure, and I think Tennessee as well for sure. Up until about 2 years ago, they were downplaying slavery and Jim Crow, and they weren't, you wouldn't get a full picture of what was going on. Now, if you're having 1619 project curriculum where they're overplaying it, now, do you see some of this stuff that's coming out now that's overplaying things like the 1619 as an overcorrection of what was going on before, or is it just 2 competing sides that are gaining power?
I'm going to bang on my unknown and unknowable drum, but the 1619 project is a really interesting test case. Excuse me, I better clear my throat. So, we needn't belabor the controversies over the 1619 project. I'm guessing that everybody has heard about it and is well aware that it is a controversial attempt to reimagine the founding of the United States of America from 1776 to 1619, when the first enslaved Africans were brought to the continent. Historians have a lot of issues with it. So the New York Times, they won a Pulitzer for this, and there's a curriculum associated with it. It's produced by an outfit called the Pulitzer Center. So now, if you look at the website of the Pulitzer Center, they will say, from memory, that something like 5,000 schools are now, quote, teaching the 1619 project. And that sounds alarming to those of us who are concerned about the content of kids' education and worry about, whether they're getting, this historically questionable view of events. Well, there are exactly, as far as I can tell, having looked recently, 3 school systems in America that have expressly authorized this. And I believe they are Chicago, Buffalo, and I can't remember the third one, maybe Washington, Baltimore, Washington, D.C. So there's a big variance there. 3 districts have said, yes, we teach this, but the Pulitzer Center is claiming 5,000 schools. So what's the deal here? Well, the deal is almost certainly what I alluded to earlier, that teachers are encouraged to find material at any given day to engage students that is relevant to them, et cetera. So almost certainly those 5,000 schools are I don't think they're lying, but the teachers in those schools and others are just probably sampling this stuff, downloading it. But here's what you don't know. Okay, if you're assigning a Nicole Hannah-Jones essay from the 1619 Project, are you also assigning a companion reading that offers a different point of view? Unknown and unknowable. I happen to not be a big fan of the idea of, quote, banning critical race theory or banning things like the 1619 Project. That feels anti-intellectual to me. But the concern that people have is this issue of balance, this issue of accuracy. So it's just, believe me, if I had a way of or an idea to tell you how we could best monitor this and know the quality of education and the different inputs that kids are getting, I'd tell you. I think it's a structural impossibility right now. So it leads to a lot of gnashing of teeth about, wait a minute, what are my kids learning? Are they being indoctrinated? Or is it the stuff that you cited before from Texas, that they're learning that slavery was no big deal, et cetera? It's just damn hard to know exactly at any given moment what kids are or are not learning, what ideas they're being exposed to that may be inaccurate, wrong-headed, or simply unacceptable.
Something you said there about banning CRT, things like that. Now, the way I look at it is this, okay, John McWhorter's written a lot about it. James Lindsay had done a few things. I recently did a thing comparing this stuff to Islam, like the social justice stuff, comparing it to parts of Islam and how it works like that. So there is a religious aspect to it. So I don't want to see curriculum based on it, just like I wouldn't want to see curriculum based on, Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Scientology or anything like that. But yeah, I think that if you are teaching a history course and you bring up the 1619 Project as this was someone's take on it. This was, they put it out, and you can discuss the controversy around it, just like in a college course, or maybe a seniors in high school when they're learning about the Holocaust can learn about the protocols of Elders of Zion, which is complete conspiracy theory, and they can talk about those things. And I don't think, yeah, okay, like I said, I'm just putting things out, but I don't think that basing the curriculum on it is correct, or basing the text on it, but having it taught in the classroom as this is something that it was, I don't think that should be a problem. I think, I think
most thinking people would agree with that. In other words, it does feel quite anti-intellectual to say there are certain ideas that are so volatile that they are third rails and cannot be touched. Like the Voldemort approach. He who must not be named. I just don't think intelligent people conduct themselves that way and want to insulate kids from unpleasant ideas. But there's acres of daylight, obviously, between teaching something and preaching something, and that's the rub. In other words, find me a parent. I'm sure they exist, but I think they're rare. Who would say, no, I don't want the words, quote, critical race theory ever to leave a teacher's mouth in a public school. That's not okay. Most people would say, well, this is, just like other, ideologies. It's important to be well educated and have multiple lenses through which to view and discuss history. That's what educated people do. But when it crosses the line from, a theory, a lens, and a theology, so to speak, where this is the received wisdom and this is the way that we view events, and so will you too, then it's obviously a problem.
Okay, again, like I said, I've been looking at some of this, and I've been kind of looking at this since about 2014, just trying to figure out. I mean, this all came about because I tried to figure out why I was being called a white supremacist for criticizing Islam. And I was
Right.
like, okay,
Right.
where's that coming from? And then, like I said, I started looking into a lot of this. Now, this is my theory. It might be tinfoil hat. It might be whatever. But
I've heard them all. By me.
The way I look at it is like if you look at some of the stuff that Jonathan Haidt has done, and especially with Greg Lukianoff, and they're talking about like the mid '80s when the scare came up about kids being abducted and the stranger danger and whatever, and then you had more control on how parents could let their kids away, and you scared parents. Then I'm looking at some of the stuff that Lenore Skenazy is doing recently with free range kids.
Yep, she's a friend.
And I'm looking at that, and I'm like, okay, so from the mid 80s till about now, where it's gotten to the point you can't let your kids go to the park, you've curtailed parents' time. Like parents have to be with their kids all the time. Like when I was growing up, on the weekends, we were gone from breakfast until dinner time, right? Like, like this is in the 70s and the 80s.
I know I had parents. I just don't, they didn't loom large in my day-to-day life.
But that gave parents the time to, be together, talk about things. They weren't constantly looking at the kids. And then again, like this stuff comes through and parents aren't really paying attention to what's being taught to their kids because they don't have the time. So now like this last year with Zoom classes and stuff, when parents were able to sit in a little bit and hear what's going on. Yeah. So like my whole thing on this was it's more of a problem of time. And I'm not saying that this was some grand conspiracy or anything like that, but it just so happened that parents' times got whittled away and the colleges of education slightly changed their focus. And so those two things kind of converged around 2010 and it just started getting worse. So it's like, that's where my thinking on this, like it's not just a simple problem of fixing the schools. There's a lot of other things that need to go on as well.
A lot of moving parts without question. Yeah. I mean, I think I might quibble with the time frame somewhat. I mean, there has been a strain of thought common to schools of education going back 100 years that it is the job and obligation of teachers and schools to be, quote, agents of change and to, consciously seek to remake, society along lines congenial to social justice activists. That's really not new. It has taken on sort of a more aggressive tinge post George Floyd. And with the current vogue for anti-racism and critical race theory, but critical race theory is not new. I mean, that's been around since the 70s, by name. So there's not a lot here that is necessarily new and different. But it kind of it ebbs and flows. It goes from an acute to a chronic condition, so to speak, and never quite goes away. I don't mean this to sound dismissive, but American education particularly is awfully fad driven. You hear about things with great intensity for 18 months and then they just disappear. So at the moment, I'm not suggesting that critical race theory and anti-racism is, quote, a fad, but it is taken on. There's an evangelical zeal attached to it because of things that are going on in the broader world. And there's some genuine controversy. I mean, this was what I wrote about in that piece that I think occasioned you to invite me onto this podcast. I'm teaching Black and brown kids exclusively for 20 years. I've never stood in front of a white student in my life, and as a result of that work, I've been kind of brought up with a certain set of expectations about what is best practice for reaching and teaching those students. In other words, my flavor of educational equity is, I guess, somewhat traditional. It's although still controversial, it was quite common in the early days of the charter school movement. It was about high expectations, both for academics and behavior. It was about safe schools. It was about rich curriculum. It was about creating the expectation that every kid could and perhaps should go to college. In other words, creating the conditions in schools like the one where I used to teach that are more likely to be found in well-off suburban schools, for example, closing that achievement gap, that expectation gap. Well, some of those ideas I feel are under direct attack through the tenets of anti-racism. And as we speak at my elbow, I've got a copy of Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. And this has become kind of a bit of a Bible for good reasons, right? I mean, who isn't anti-racist? Nobody's in favor of racism, but that's not necessarily the project that Kendi has in mind. So his work is an assault on things like the achievement gap. He has written that to even talk about an achievement gap is to engage in racially hierarchical thinking and therefore racist. Well, the work that I and others have done for 20 years is directly aimed at eliminating that achievement gap. An awful lot of political oxygen and moral authority in school choice, in charter schools, in just general education has been aimed at closing that achievement gap. Because of the shame that we feel over the disparate outcomes for Black and white students. So it's a bit of a stunner, frankly, to spend 20 years in this work and then read Kendi and find out, oh no, that's you're racist to even think about that. Well, is that true? Can we examine that, or is this now a third rail that we cannot discuss? I can give you other examples, but I think you take the larger point, which is that there is a philosophical movement right now that is making a very different set of assumptions about what is in the best interest of Black and brown students that is heavily informed by critical race theory, by thinkers like Ibram X. Kendi. And it may or may not be in the best interest of those students. In my personal and professional opinion, I think it's not. And and the piece that I wrote says so. And says, here's why. It's because of these various factors. I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that I'm in sole possession of the truth here. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But I think we have danced around these issues obliquely for far too long, and we need to address them head on.
Just on that. So, I mean, there's a school in the UK, Michaela School, and I spoke with the headmistress there.
Oh, she's fantastic.
Yeah, Catherine's great. I mean, now, when the results started coming out, she was getting attacked. It almost looked like she was getting attacked for succeeding. And
that's right.
And again, when you read this stuff in Sol's book, and I don't want to say that's definitive because, I mean, he only concentrated on a few schools, but you have a school that has the same population base, two schools in the same building that have, that are using the same population base, and one is doing exceedingly well and the other one's doing awfully. It should, if you're an educator, or if you're in the school boards, or if you're Department of Education, or whatever, you should look at why those two schools. I mean, that's a perfect test case there. You have a control group and you have an experimental group, and so why don't they want to look at that? Like, okay, I'm brown.
This is what it's. Sorry to interrupt. I mean, this is the theme of my own book, which you cited before, called "How the Other Half Learns," about Success Academy, which is, you could think of it as the American equivalent of Catherine Birbelsing's Michaela School. Very similar. I mean, I've never been to Michaela, but from what I understand, they are. Eva Moskowitz, who founded Success, and Catherine they're like-minded. I think they're kindred spirits in many ways and in their approach. And look, I'm a fan, or I'm deeply respectful of what Eva Moskowitz and Success Academy have accomplished. But the point of my book, the news, so to speak, was that it's really not an apples to apples comparison for very complicated reasons, which I won't bore you with. It's not as if they just, I mean, because this is the myth that we've told ourselves for years, that the only difference is the door that the kid walks into. They walk into my old school, they get a bad outcome. They walk into Success Academy, they get a good outcome. If you look into the details of who applies, there's a bit of a winnowing process. There's a self-selection that kind of separates the parents of one. They're different in terms of their attitude, their motivation. None of this, I want to be really clear about this. None of this suggests, or should be taken to suggest, that there's, quote, cheating going on, that somebody's got their thumb on the scale. It just makes the comparisons inept. My point is, that's okay. When did we ever decide in this country that it was a bad thing to be motivated, to be ambitious, to seek out the best opportunities you could for kids? I mean, broadly speaking, the theme of my book is to say, look, if you are white and affluent in this country, you already have something approaching perfect school choice. You either have the resources to pay for private school tuition, or perhaps to move to the suburbs if your neighborhood school is terrible. And that's unremarkable. But if you are black or brown and poor, and then Eva Moskowitz comes along and creates a similar opportunity for you, suddenly we think that's unfair because there are some kids who are not able to take advantage of this. Well, there's, that probably is true. But on the other hand, that's an odd way to keep score, or it's an odd way to apply different standards to different groups. It's unremarkable and uncontroversial when I pull my daughter out of her public school and send her to a private school. But when Eva Moskowitz or Catherine create an opportunity for those who normally do not have those kinds of choices, well, then it's a crisis. And we need to examine our assumptions about that.
Just wanted to, I don't want to keep you too much longer because I know you've got things to do, unlike me. But I wanted to ask you about one thing, because this is like a debate I've been looking at recently and I've heard about it. And I guess this is again something that's been around for a while. So let's just take it with reading. So it's either teach to read or read to, learn to read or read to learn type of thing. Now, I get that. And I understand that, while you're taking a history class, you're reading in that history class. And now if you're reading something that's interesting, that's teaching you the history, it's a lot better than a dry textbook, but that can also help you learn to read and help you learn to make arguments. I just don't like some people I hear saying it should be started right away. And I'm thinking, okay, well, until the kid learns the alphabet, can't really read to learn type of thing, right? Like
Sure.
You have to have the basics. So where do you fall on that debate? Like, where do you think that comes in, and how soon do you think you should start that?
This is, you've unwittingly stumbled on the issue that took me from being a 2-year mid-career public service stint, go back to my field teacher, and 20 years second career educator. Because in my school in the South Bronx, it was, I became I started with kind of a willing suspension of disbelief about the way we were teaching reading. Then that turned into sort of a curiosity about it, and then frankly, a militance about it. I am a unapologetic disciple of a fellow named E.D. Hirsch Jr., who some may recall as the author of a book from 40 years ago called Cultural Literacy. And he's the founder and still chairman of the board in his 90s of the Core Knowledge Foundation, which stresses a certain flavor of education, which is kind of my flavor of education. In other words, so I mean, I'll try to summarize this quickly, but Hirsch's insight was that in order to read with comprehension, kids need a wealth of background knowledge. And at a molecular level, so to speak, writers and speakers make assumptions about what their audiences, their listeners and readers know. So if you think of language as being like an iceberg, there's the 26 letters of the alphabet and the words above the waterline. Then there's this massive amount of assumed knowledge, idioms, allusions, etc., that kind of inform your literacy. So every teacher, I would argue, like me, who has stood in front of a struggling group of low-income kids in a place like the South Bronx, has had the phenomenon of a kid who could read, and I'm again making air quotes around the word read. They could say the words, they could decode them, but then they would say the thing we've all heard: well, I read it, but I didn't get it. Well, Hirsch's theories offer almost alone among major educational theorists a reason for that. It has nothing to do with any of the fashionable notions we have about student engagement and culturally relevant pedagogy. It has to do with background knowledge. If the readers and writers are not on the same page, you're going to have that I read it but didn't get it phenomenon. So his vision of reading is mine at the end of the day. And sorry, at the risk of going way far afield from your very important question, we're having a moment in this country where at long last, I feel like the tide is somewhat turning, and those who advocate what has become known as the science of reading are having their day. Now that includes not just things like background knowledge in the Hersheyan view, but it does include things like a strict approach to phonics, which is more complicated than that. It's phonemic awareness, it's fluency, etc. But I feel like we are finally getting some momentum around the idea that, look, there is a right way to teach reading. We've known it for a long time, and damn it, we're going to do it that way. I mean, you're starting to see legislative action in 20 odd states to more or less demand this so-called science of reading approach. Ed schools are getting more serious about teaching it. I think this is not a magic bullet. It's not going to change overnight, but it's if you told me 20 years ago that we'd be seeing the kind of interest and momentum for scientifically sound reading practices that we're seeing now, I would not have believed it. So, again, it's not over. It's an ongoing struggle. It perhaps always will be, but there's reasons to be encouraged.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Like I said, I've just, because I had one of my friends saying, okay, you should start this right away. And I'm like, well, until the kid can actually learn the alphabet and, learn some stuff. So I was thinking, if you start around the third grade, like just some schmuck on Twitter.
Third grade is too late. I mean, if we know nothing else, we know that. If you see a kid who is not reading at grade level by third grade, I don't know the data, but it's something like 90% of kids who are reading below grade level at third grade, they will never read at grade level. This is why you've seen in any number of states these so-called third grade reading laws or challenges that require kids to be held back if they are not reading proficiently by third grade. Now, those are problematic too. I mean, I agree with that impulse, but it's not just about, you can't just do more of what's not working and expect that it's going to change results. If you've got schools where a lot of kids aren't reading by third grade, well, that's a problem, and you need to be curious about why it keeps happening, not just say hold them back. So all of these issues tend to be complicated. But I mean, the point of the anecdote I told a moment ago is, and don't get the idea that I'm anti-phonic, so to speak. I'm quite the opposite. But it's not that hard. It's relatively easy, comparatively easy, I guess I should say, to get kids who can, quote, decode, know their letters, be able to sound out words. The real challenge is a mature sense of reading comprehension. And that's a slow growing plant, and it requires, if you accept the E.D. Hirsch model, which I do, it requires a lot of art and science and history and literature. It can't just be, follow your bliss and learn about whatever you want. That's like going to the gym and just working out your arms because you enjoy doing arms and you never do leg day. Or pick your own analogy. At the end of the day, there are no shortcuts. You have kids of any race or background need a rich, cognitively demanding curriculum. If they don't get that and we don't stick to it year after year rigorously and programmatically, there's no reason to expect we're going to see anything other than what we've seen for the last 50 years, which is this kind of just dull hum of mediocrity.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to end. Thanks a lot. I mean, if you want to let people know where they can get a hold of you, if you got any last words on school choice or anything like that, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about these issues. As you can tell, 20 years in, I still get kind of animated talking about them. I'm not hard to find in this day and age of social media. It's Robert Pondiscio, so it's R Pondiscio at Twitter, also on Facebook, and I most of the stuff that I write tends to show up at the website of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which is a Washington-based think tank.
Hey, well, again, thanks a lot for coming on. It was great.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
And thanks everyone for listening.